Hello, everybody. I'm Logan Crawford, and this is the award-winning TV talk show right here on Ebru Fresh Outlook. Terror and suspicion. An attack by extremists on a Mali hotel kills 19 people. The assault comes 1 week after militants wounded or killed hundreds in a series of attacks in Paris and Beirut as well. And 3 weeks after ISIS allegedly downed a Russian airliner over Egypt, killing all 224 people on board. The reaction from the Russian president, a global crackdown on terror, and here in the United States and in Western Europe as well, a lot of suspicion, particularly about Syrian refugees. Let's say hello to the Fresh Outlook expert panel. I am joined by Alain Sanders, political science professor at St. Peter's University, Yohuru Williams, dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Fairfield University, and John Davenport, director of Peace and Justice Studies, the program there at Fordham University. John, I'll start with you. If even 1% of these Syrian refugees are ISIS, is that reason enough for America to say, you know what, you can't come here?
No, I don't think so. First of all, I don't think anything like 1%, 1 in 100 would prove to have those kinds of connections.
1 in 1,000?
1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000. I mean, we might find 1 or 2 or 3 we're suspicious of who would be excluded in our very detailed and demanding screening process that the president talked about in some of his speeches this week. I'm pretty confident that we can screen out those people. We have to remember that the situation in Europe is completely different. The refugees coming in droves, boatload after boatload at a time to small Greek islands that have no staff are just being kind of waved right through. There's no screening at all. I don't think we need to be afraid of that scenario, and we shouldn't allow ISIS to win on this. I feel very strongly about the moral principles behind this issue that I think most Americans, if they remember what we stand for in this country, will agree with, which is that we need to help people who are in desperate straits because of a war that we and our allies in Europe have not stepped up to stop. That's part of the reason why there's such a huge refugee flow here. And this country has a historical legacy of having welcomed immigrants. We need to help these people, and we cannot let ISIS win by scaring us off, by cowing us, by preventing us from doing what morality requires because of fear.
Alan, you've got to understand the guttural reaction that a lot of people have. They see what happened in Paris. Could have been Madison Square Garden. It could have been restaurants on Madison Avenue. It could have been anywhere in New York, Boston, LA. And they're scared, and they're saying it isn't necessarily necessary that we allow Syrian refugees into the country, so why not keep them out? These aren't my viewpoints, but you're hearing it a lot on social media and in the media in general.
Sure. Well, fear is a great political driver, and what's unfortunate is we're in the middle of an election campaign. So you've basically got the Republican led by two fearmongers, Donald Trump and Ben Carson, fueling the fire, so to speak. Terrorists will always look for the easy way to get in. If you let terrorists know that you're going to be patrolling the borders thoroughly, you're going to be screening refugees thoroughly, that would not be a very productive way to sneak in a terrorist. So I think we have to be mindful of our humanitarian past, of the fact that we're a nation of immigrants, but also be quite aggressive in patrolling the borders. If we do that, if that message goes out, then I think the threat of terrorists sneaking through the refugee crisis will be minimal, if anything at all. Well, the real driving problem here is that many people do not trust Barack Obama. He's been quite weak on foreign policy. He's been quite weak in projecting American power, both in terms of image and in terms of reality. And what's really driving the problem is fear-mongering on the right and lack of trust of President Obama. And that's the political situation we find ourselves in.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. Yohuru, I got to tell you, when I saw Barack Obama speak from Turkey and say, I'm not going to position ourselves like we're winning. I mean, this is days after a devastating attack on our oldest ally, and he's not saying we're going to position ourselves like we're winning. Well, what are we going to do? Position ourselves like we're losing? This is not the kind of rhetoric that red-blooded Americans want to hear.
It may not be the rhetoric they want to hear, but it may be the rhetoric that's realistic in the modern moment that we find ourselves. The mission accomplished that we got from George Bush, the idea that somehow we're going to conquer terrorists, or you go out and you project strength in the midst of fighting an enemy that really is in the shadows. It's hard in this context to talk about this in the same way that we talk about a traditional war. We're fighting against forces that can coalesce at any moment, that are underground, that really materialize, that radicalize. I think part of the problem with rejecting refugees out of hand is that the radicalization process can happen anywhere. You have Westerners who've been radicalized and become part of this, radical Islam terrorist strain. So it's very difficult in that sense to blame any one person or to blame any one thing. You understand why governors are saying, from a political standpoint, that they don't want refugees to come into their particular states. You have the president then in Turkey in the uncomfortable position of having to represent American values abroad, and to have to say, in kind of a war of words with politicians here, this is who we are as a nation. Having said all that, I have to agree with you, Alan. I think part of Obama's, and this has been true on a couple of different fronts, his inability to project strength sometimes gets him into trouble. And on this particular issue, although the messaging is right, the projection is off.
He's been compared to Spock by Maureen Dowd. He just seems like he's very professorial, not to knock any of you guys since you're all professors, but you have more heart and humanity at times, and this man appears to have. I'm just going to get to you in just a second, Alan. John, I want to ask you about the feud going on between Chris Christie and Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York City, the governor of New Jersey. The governor of New Jersey says, I don't want anybody in this country from Syria who is a refugee. It can't be kept safe. De Blasio holds up a picture of a dead toddler on the beach and says this is what the fat man is scared of. So.
I completely agree with Mayor de Blasio. And I live in New Jersey, and I no longer consider Chris Christie my governor. I wouldn't recognize his authority. I think the statements he's made are so atrocious that I would tell him to his face that he's a coward and he should resign and get out. If he doesn't have the courage to stand up to ISIS, part of their goal is to try to get Western powers, especially the United States, to alienate Muslims around the world. So when we have governors like Christie or Bobby Jindal or senators, from Florida standing up and saying that we consider all of these people from Syria to be terrorists, that's exactly what ISIS wants. My former governor, as I consider him here in New Jersey, is falling exactly into that trap. I think he ought to quit the presidential campaign and get out. And I'm just appalled at the statements that Republicans across the spectrum of governors and candidates in this presidential race have made. I mean, it sounds to me like these people would have returned boatloads of Jews, at the beginning of the Holocaust, as Franklin Roosevelt did. I'd like to ask some of them, what about prior atrocities and cases? We took many refugees from Cuba, for example, when the Castro regime came to power and did its purges and was arresting so many political opponents. Should we not have taken those people?
I'm going to stop you there. We have some video to let you listen to about this squabble between de Blasio and Christie. Take a listen.
Not trust this administration to effectively vet the people who are proposed to be coming in order to protect the safety and security of the American people, so I would not permit them in.
Is this what he wants to see happen to people? Is this what he wants to see happen to children? We don't accept that here in New York City.
Not trust this administration to effectively vet the people.
Alan, as I watch this, it's really heartbreaking because I'll tell you, I grew up in an era where the immigrants were Irish and Italian. And they were looked down upon because of their religion and their ethnicity. They were called mix and they were called wops and other bad words as well. Now you've got a huge middle class that's blossoming here in the United States, and many are Muslim. And they are your cab drivers, they're your doctors, they are your lawyers, they're your scientists, they're your teachers. And they're trying to be part of the American fabric. Right. And time again, these notions of Islamophobia are hammered down people's throats by fearmongers, by politicians, by our supposed leaders, and it's really heartbreaking for those good people in the United States.
Sure, and I think you've hit one of the issues here. But going back to that video and that you just showed, both are extremist positions. Both are feeding off of emotion. You've got Governor Christie feeding off of the fear factor, and you've got Mayor de Blasio feeding off of the compassion factor. You cannot make public policy on the basis of emotion. Both are correct. There is a humanitarian crisis, and there is a national security crisis. And going back to the Obama statement, Obama sounded good if he were talking to his aides, if he was talking in the White House, in the National Security Council chambers. That's the kind of deliberation, calm, cool analysis that you want from a president. But it is not what you want from a president when there is fear, when there is a crisis. You want a posture of confidence, you want a posture of muscular strength, as well as moral strength. And that's where he fell down. There was nothing wrong with what he said had he said it in the National Security Council with his aides. There's much that is wrong when he is trying to reassure the public, because he wasn't reassuring. And if you're not reassuring as a leader, then you get this kind of debate that goes on between the de Blasios and the Christies.
Yohuru, I'm going to pick up on a point you made before, that fighting the war on terror is fighting an unorthodox enemy. That's been said for generations, that it's been difficult to fight terrorists because you never know where they're going to pop up, creep up, emerge. That's a little different this time because now there is ISIS that has created this power structure in Syria and Iraq. So why can't we go after them more easily than terrorists in the past?
Well, we can go and bomb the sites where we think they are, but how effective was that in Afghanistan and how effective was that in Iraq? The problem is, and we saw this in the Paris attacks, they're communicating now through Xbox, through gaming systems. So as we evolve, they evolve as well. And their ability really to scan the landscape in the same way that we are and attempting to fight them and find new ways to communicate, new ways to strike fear and terror in the hearts of ordinary citizens. What's troubling about the Paris attacks is that these are not political targets. This is, an arena where people are enjoying a concert. That strikes fear in the heart of people in Dubuque, Iowa, as much as it does New York City. So in this sense, ISIL wins if we respond in a way that we become paralyzed. We have students now who are concerned about study abroad. They win. We have a president who, I agree, strikes the right moral tone, but doesn't do so in a way that says, get out, do what you ordinarily do. We're not going to succumb to fear. They're really, in this case, it's our ability to project and to be savvy enough to understand that this is not the war on terror of 5 years ago. It is constantly evolving, and those political leaders that are willing to agree with that and to follow that through are going to be the most effective in addressing that. But that will require them to really come out and say, we're prepared to meet the threat however it manifests itself.
I agree with you in part, but I think the problem is Obama's approach to fighting terror seems half-hearted. When the French wanted to retaliate after the ISIS strike, John, they were given 2 targets immediately by the United States and said, here, go bomb their training facility and go bomb their munitions dump.
Right.
If these things exist, why didn't we knock them out as soon as we knew about it? We're not fighting to win.
And they move those things around, and we end up hitting empty buildings or civilians in Iraq. I mean, although I voted twice for Obama, I absolutely agree with the comments made on this panel that he's been weak on this. And we do need to take the fight directly to ISIS on the ground in Syria and Iraq. That's the only way, although they use all sorts of sophisticated communication technology today. I completely agree with that aspect of the threat. I think we could severely degrade their capacity to have a kind of central command and training area, the nerve center, if you like, of this operation to recruit people. Look at how ineffective, for example, Al-Qaeda is not recruiting people to bomb in France, because we have greatly reduced their capacity. We need to do the same thing on the ground with with ISIS in Syria and Iraq. To get to the root of this problem is going to require 50, 60,000 ground troops from Turkey, from Saudi Arabia, from Jordan, coming different directions. But the United States and Western allies are going to have to lead that, and the president has not been willing to do it. I think he was almost prepared to do it in late summer of 2013, and the whole effort got nixed. There was a vote against it in the British Parliament, and the whole thing.
He doesn't want to be a war president.
Right.
That's what it comes down to.
Right.
He was elected twice because he was going to bring our soldiers home, and more or less he's done that. And now he's faced with a war that if he doesn't fight, his legacy will be destroyed, because ISIS will have blossomed on his watch.
Right.
Final thoughts?
I totally agree with that. It's not just the projection of the perception of power, but it's real power. And many people, I mean, you go back to his so-called red line on Syria, which Syria violated, and he did nothing. You look at the weak response on the Crimea and Ukraine, and you look at that horrible agreement on nuclear arms, which is really a nuclear deal with Iran, which is really a nuclear arms agreement between Iran and China and Russia. Very weak, and so many people don't trust him. There's no real projection of power, there's no real perception of power, and the chaos that is going around is not solely his fault, but certainly he has contributed to the chaos by not projecting the reality of military power as well as the perception of military power.
Final thought to Yohuru.
At this point, the president is concerned about his legacy. You can understand that. Winding down in the second term, that's problematic in terms of addressing these issues, because here's a president to receive the Nobel Peace Prize who's become synonymous with drones and indiscriminate bombing. You can understand in some sense why he is projecting that, but at the same time, if Americans feel insecure as a result, you've got to respond to that insecurity.
Can I add something quickly? I completely agree with these worries about Obama's performance on this issue. And I really think that, if we want to push back against the advance of Iran's power and the increase of Putin's power, that, dealing with both Assad and ISIS in Syria and Iraq is part of that. We have to understand that if we defeat ISIS and we defeat the Assad regime, which is going to be necessary to get those majority Sunni Arab nations on our side in a military coalition, that actually it really degrades the advance of Iran's power. And because we have to understand that Iran and Putin are both allies of the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, which has killed over 200,000 people. So that's got to be part of this as well.
Okay, thank you very much, John. My 2 cents is he who vacillates is lost. Barack Obama, take note. Now there are 1 million people on the move, millions in fact. We will take a look at the human face of the Syrian refugee crisis after this.